Come on in.
Hi, how are you?
Would you like a tea or coffee?
I'm the one that takes a coffee before sugar.
I think there's a seat over here. Give me a seat, I'll get the tea or coffee.
Hello everybody, come in, please find a seat.
Come on in, get a cuddle and a cuppa.
With all of us together, it'll be chaotically beautiful. Let us all sit and enjoy the brew and blether.
Hello and welcome to A Brew A Blether, a community-produced podcast funded by the Great Place Scheme and recorded in partnership with Erskine Arts about the lives of women and non-binary people in Renfrewshire. I'm Jules, this is Frankie.
Hello.
We're volunteers at Kairos Women Plus, and in this series we're focusing on women's heritage. By that we mean how women's lives are remembered. In this series we'll be talking about our experiences collaborating with Paisley Museum, poorhouses and poverty in Renfrewshire, the legacy of slavery in Scotland, and finally Section 28 LGBTQ+ education and representation.
We wanted to explore some of the more marginalised voices in Renfrewshire's history, so our focus is not just on Women Plus, but on underrepresented groups more generally, working class, BAME and LGBTQ+ folks, and the documented histories we have uncovered, or more often struggle to find. We believe that documenting the lives of marginalised groups now is the key to a more representative history in the future, so we hope this podcast can contribute to a more representative heritage sector in Renfrewshire and beyond.
Content warning. This episode contains racism and slavery as themes, so please be kind and switch off if you find anything triggering. In this episode we hear from 11-year-old Erin McAleer and her mum Leah McAleer, who live in Lochwinnoch. As head of her house in Primary 7, Erin campaigned to change the name of her schoolhouse, which had been named after Colonel McDowall, a slave trader from Scotland who had settled in Renfrewshire. William McDowall started his career as an overseer of slaves in the Caribbean, going on to eventually manage one of the largest plantations on the island. By 1707, McDowall owned his own small plantation on St Kitts and purchased 12 enslaved Africans. When the French were ousted from half of the island, he was granted the 800-acre Canada Hills plantation, which then went on to be his family's core plantation for the next century. Back in Glasgow, McDowall used the profit from his plantation to repair the Shawfield mansion damaged in the Shawfield riots of 1725. He then bought the Castle Semple estate in Lochwinnoch and subsequently owned land in many other parts of Renfrewshire, stretching from Lochwinnoch to the fringes of Mearns at Cathcart. He had the castle on Lochwinnoch estate demolished and built a modern villa in a similar style to the Shawfield mansion. He retired to his Castle Semple estate but was still involved in the shipping of enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean. The ship, the Fair Parnelia, carried 273 enslaved persons from the Gold Coast in 1727, but it was overcrowded and capsized in the mid-Atlantic, drowning all but one of the enslaved people imprisoned below the deck. For more information about Colonel McDowall, you can visit www.mearnshistory.org.uk and read Profile of a Glasgow Merchant by Stuart Nisbet. We'll share more reading about links to slavery in Scotland as well as anti-racist resources in the podcast description so you can access those in your own time.
We start off with Erin reading an article written by Leah for the Kairos Chronicle about the story of Cato, an enslaved child who ran away from McDowall's estate in Castle Semple, documented in a newspaper clipping from the Caledonian Mercury dating from the 2nd of February 1748. And about why this story deserves to be told. We will then hear an interview by Kairos volunteer Arti Gosai with Erin and Leah about their experiences as anti-racist campaigners and the wider implications of having not acknowledged the brutal aspects of Renfrewshire's past. We then leave you with Laura Hamilton talking you through Renfrewshire Leisure's Frederick Douglass walking tour, which you can do in your own time to remember his work as an abolitionist campaigner and his time in Paisley in 1846.
Gone from Castle Semple, 12 miles from Glasgow, on Saturday the 30th of January, a Negro lad named Cato, the property of Colonel McDowall of Castle Semple. Whoever secures him, so as to be returned to Colonel McDowall the owner, shall be sufficiently rewarded, and it is earnestly desired that no person may entertain him as he has left his master's service without any just cause. Once upon a time, in Lochwinnoch village, in these woods, there lived a boy named Cato. He was not born here, he did not choose to be here, and he did not want to be here. He was held against his will in the home of Colonel William McDowall. He was treated as if he were property. One day, in the middle of winter, he ran away. History doesn't record the rest of Cato's story, and we only know this fragment from an advert published in a paper in 1748 seeking his return. We know that Cato was not the only child imprisoned and dehumanized by Colonel McDowall. We know that he was one of hundreds of men, women and children whose exploitation and enslavement made Colonel McDowall a very wealthy man. Last year, we started to ask ourselves and our community why it is that McDowall, the captor and slave trader, is commemorated in our primary school, while Cato is forgotten. Erin, a P7 pupil, was elected the house captain of McDowall House and used her platform to raise awareness of who McDowall was and the atrocities he was responsible for. She started a conversation that stretched far beyond our small village, that raised a groundswell of support and uncovered deep-rooted animosities. Erin pointed out that this man's legacy was not aligned with the values of her school and requested that his name be removed and replaced from her schoolhouse. When we ask these types of questions, we do not always like the answer we get. Our community told us that they did not want this name to change. Furthermore, that they did not even want to have a conversation about the possibility of change or what change could mean. This is what happens when our stories are reduced to binary, to a yes or a no, to an us or a them. But in truth, we cannot vote against change any more than we could vote against the dawn or vote out the rain. Change will happen whether we embrace it or rail against it. 14 months after Erin first asked the question that divided the community, her younger brother came down from school clutching a bundle of papers. Among it was a letter addressed to Erin from the head teacher, copied to every family in the school. It said that the change Erin had suggested was coming and invited her to be part of shaping the future of the school to promote equality and diversity. Walking through the same woods Cato ran through on his bid for escape, I think about the freedom we have to walk these paths. I think about all of the men, women and children like Cato, whose freedom was bought and sold to pay for ours. How their stories echo through time, how their subjugation laid the foundations for systemic racism that still stands to this day, that still imprisons, disadvantages and kills people for the colour of their skin. The paths I tread through these woods have all been walked before. That is why the paths are here. The signs we place along the way have meaning, and sometimes we need to stop and examine those signs to see if they are guiding us in the right direction. If we place the name McDowall up high where our children can see it, where are we guiding them? If we ask them to cheer his name on sports day, what are we asking them to cheer for? People would point out, quite rightly, that we cannot change history by changing the names, but perhaps we can change the future. Perhaps we are not meant to follow these well-trodden paths forevermore. Perhaps we are meant to forge new ways through the woods. This morning I found a new path through the woods I've walked countless times before. It was a path I hadn't even noticed until now. It reminded me that just because we are used to seeing the world from certain perspectives, that doesn't mean these are the only perspectives there are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Kairos podcast, A Brew A Blether. I am your host, Arti Gosai, and I'm a volunteer at Kairos Women Plus. And my guests for this evening are Erin and Leah. I'll pass it over to Erin and Leah, and you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm a student and activist.
And I'm Leah. I'm Erin's mum and a GP.
Thank you for that. I'm going to be jumping straight in, going to the first question. What was your motivation to start researching the history of the house name McDowall?
Well, we started looking into it. It was during COVID. We were homeschooling, and it was around the time of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protests. And it was something I'd seen. There's an information board at Lochwinnoch train station which talks about McDowall, and it talks about him having made his money on Jamaican sugar plantations. And I read that and I thought, okay, that's interesting that they've termed it that way, because I know what that means. That means he made his money from slaves. If you made your money in the 18th century trading sugar, that's how you made your money. But no mention of slavery was on the board. And then we were talking about it in the context of what was going on internationally and how relevant that was for where we live. And then we just started looking into it and researching online, just as part of a kind of a homeschool project, really.
We found quite a lot of different interesting sources. I think we found, was it 3 originally and then found more later? I think that was how it went.
Yeah, lots of different articles explaining in a bit more detail about who McDowall was and his involvement in the slave trade and the Caribbean slave trade. And at that point, that's when Erin realised Erin was in the house McDowall in her school, and started to question whether that was an appropriate name. For the primary school house. And you raised it with your head teacher at that point, didn't you?
I raised it with Mrs. Bell, and she was very supportive of the idea of changing the names. She said we should have a survey to find out all the opinions and take that into account. And my motivation to ask that was, as Mum said, I was in the House McDowall and there was a House McDowall at our school, and I thought, why don't we change this? Because it isn't right to have a primary school house named after a slave trader.
True that. So what was your experience of leading the campaign as a young person, and initially when, you approached the school head, you were received positively, but did you think that you would actually go down that road of having to campaign?
I didn't actually think that would be necessary at first. But then there was it was put off a lot, so it was put off till when the school year started, and then it was put off till the house captains were elected, and then I decided to email further and asked more like what was going on and when the vote was going to happen. And I guess that was kind of when the campaign started.
How did that make you feel?
I think that at first I was pretty irritated, but now looking back at it, I think that actually in itself the campaign was important because it dug up a lot of history, and we found out a lot more through campaigning about the history of the village, and we raised a lot more awareness than if it had just been quietly changed.
Great. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things that seemed to me to be just very straightforward and self-evident that this was something that was wrong and should be changed. I didn't really understand the argument for keeping that name as it was, given everything we know about what he did, and also about the context of slavery as the root cause of modern day structural racism. So I didn't think it would be something that we would have to campaign on, because it just seemed like a very straightforward request that the school would accept. But I think, as Erin said, going through that process of finding out these are the views of our community, and how do we look to educate people? And that's the role of the school, is to educate people. So if people don't understand the context of this, then the school is the place to start, and to start helping young people, but also help their families and help the wider community understand why this is important and why it matters.
My next question is, can we get some clarity on the information that was sent to parents prior to the survey and subsequent vote? What do you feel could have been done better?
So I was asked to write the survey along with my fellow house captain, and we wrote out a survey. We took it down to the head teacher. She sent us back, and we changed a few wee points to make it easier to understand. And then we brought it back down to her office, and she said that that was good and that would be what they used. And then when the survey was actually put out, it was not quite the same. There were a few things changed. So where we had said just outright that McDowall was a slaver, they'd put that it was links to slavery, which aren't the same thing. And also the way it was presented, the survey was presented as more of a vote than a survey. So I think those were two of the things that could have been done a bit better.
Okay. I just want to clarify, what information is currently provided to students about the people that schoolhouses have been named after? I'm not sure how it actually works here, if you are allocated to a specific house, and is there any kind of pre-information that is provided to say, this is the house, this is the person that we have honored, this is the information? Is anything like that given to students?
I'm not sure about now, but when I was put into McDowall, that was none of it. It was known as the Red House when I was in P1, and as we moved up the school, we realised that the actual name was McDowall. There was no actual background information to clarify who McDowall was. We didn't know much that the McDowall family was a person. We just knew about the McDowall estate. So I'm not sure, because I'm not in the school, I'm not sure what it is now and what information is provided now. But also, there's no choosing what house you want to be in. You get allocated a house just by, it's not quite random because they try and have the same numbers in each house, but it's not like you get to choose which house you want to be in.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question is, why do you feel it is important for us to explore and question the history of people honoured by landmarks, street names, plaques, etc.?
I think, it comes down to the importance of our history. We are where we are because of the history of the people that came before us, and we can't really understand our role in society without understanding what the foundations that society is built upon. I think, going back to the school campaign, what I found really interesting was there was a kind of I assumed that having highlighted this, that this would be something that would be embraced as, okay, well, this is our local history and we need to understand this. But there was almost like a squeamishness about it, because when it comes to slavery and colonialism, it's history that doesn't paint British society in the best light. And so there's this tendency, I think, to look away from it or brush over it or be like, okay, let's focus on the things that we did well, which is fine. But for a complete view of what your society is, you need to look at the good and the bad. And in terms of people that we are honouring, I think it is important that we question, well, why are they honoured and why are they important, and what values do they represent that we still hold in our society? And if those values are oppression and exploitation, and I think a lot of people are like, well, that's history, we can't change it, but it does have an impact on the way we run our society now. And also it's history that still impacts on people's lives to this day. It's the foundation stone of modern day racism. So it's not something that you can just say, oh, well, that's in the past and we've moved on from it, because we still run our society according to those racial codes that were developed at that time.
Yeah, hundreds of years ago.
And if we want to change and improve our society, we need to look about where we've come from as well as where we're going in order to make any significant change.
Do you want to add anything?
I think that a lot of places are named after people, and especially if they're named after people like slave traders or people who don't cast British society in the best of light. I think that those places were named hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and that we should change them, or at least raise awareness to the fact that that's where the name came from, and that was named hundreds and hundreds of years ago and may not be relevant to today.
Yeah, today's society, yes. And it's like casting, you can say, a light on the person's true identity instead of their perceived identity from like hundreds of years ago. Thank you for that. So my next question is, drawing on the statue of slave trader Edward Colston being pulled down in Bristol during the Black Lives Matter demonstration in June 2020, what do you think should happen to existing landmarks that celebrate a history of oppression?
So I think that either it should be changed, or in the case of Edward Colston, after he was fished out of the river, he wasn't put back. He was put in a museum, and they explained that this was a statue of a slave trader. And I think that they should either change it or at least put up a sign, put it into a museum or somewhere local that this is where it came from, this is what it means, and this is why it's here. I think that that is a better thing to do than just ignoring it and acting as if it's all fine, because these people shaped today's society, and as much as it wasn't a nice way to shape today's society, they did. And I think that changing them is important, but also putting out information is important too, and knowledge is important too.
Great. I always hated history growing up in school because for me, it was always, it's the people that won, it's the people that left standing are telling the story. So it can't be the true story. And, in this case here, I just feel like it's a correction of history. And I think that's what we need to start doing. I just want to go back and, talking about, obviously, we spoke about Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and, your research started because you were being homeschooled. Do you think that it would have hit home, or that curiosity would have actually had that same amount of impact if COVID didn't happen, if Erin was still in school? I don't know. If you don't feel comfortable, please don't answer. It was just something that came to mind.
I think it's a really interesting question. Do you have something to say? No. I think, I would hope, because the conversations that we have at home, I would always aim to try and fill in where I perceive there might be gaps, and I don't necessarily know where the gaps are in the education system, but certainly for my own interest and my own research, if I look these things up, I will often share them with Erin. So I'd like to think that we would have picked up on it either way, albeit maybe not having quite as much time and space to do the research. But I think it was such a big moment internationally. I don't think that it would have passed us by. And certainly even in the context of the community that we live in. So again, we've gone from just having that one euphemistic board at the train station. Now there is more detail on the Loch Shore, where you can see exactly, in detail about what McDowall did, and it mentions explicitly that he was a slave trader. There was a short film that was made. Again, the short film was kind of inspired by lockdown, but I think there was an interest kind of in the community in terms of, what is our place? What is our role in this? So I think these things eventually at some point always do kind of come up to the surface. It's not history that can stay buried for long, because people have that desire to understand. And
I think as the community, as society, sometimes we're just conditioned into having that sense of pride without understanding why we have that sense of pride for certain monuments or certain people from history and stuff like that. But it is a thing about bringing these things forward and, re-educating. Erin, I wanted to ask you, how was your campaign as a young person in your school? How were you received by your fellow peers?
So most people didn't really mention it. Not many of the people in my class mentioned it. Me and the person who was my fellow house captain mentioned it because we created the survey, but it wasn't really mentioned between classmates.
I see a fire in you. That's very, very apparent. It's very, very clear when you walk into the room. Do you think that this situation has actually ignited something inside of you or was that always there?
I think I've wanted to be an activist for a very long time. We attended quite a lot of climate marches and one of the anti-Trump marches. I think that I have wanted to be an activist, but I think I wasn't an activist until then because I hadn't done any personal activism.
And do you remember that thing we went to at Wigtown Book Festival as well?
Oh, yeah.
There was a talk, I can't remember the title of it, it was like a panel of young activists.
Yes, I know that one.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That was really good as well. So I think it's one of those great things about being young is having that sense. And I remember it myself as well, being Erin's age and looking at the world and being able to see quite clearly where it was wrong. And also having a reasonably clear understanding of how it could be made better.
Mm-hmm.
But at that age, when I was 11, I was fairly powerless to do anything about it. Or, pre-internet, there was no, I became vegetarian, and that was it. That was all I could do. And now, I think if you're engaged and aware about the world, on the one hand, there's so much more information.
Mm-hmm.
To get through, so you can learn a lot more, but also there's it's easier to make connections with other people. It's easier to get a message out.
Mm-hmm.
If you needed to.
I think it's like the level of support. I can understand growing up like pre-internet. It feels like you're just swimming in a pool with the lights switched off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ugh, I had a thought, but while you were talking, it just floated away. Oh, I wanted to ask you as well, how has you did speak about more information around the community and around the area. Do you feel there's been a change within the community? After this information has been put out to them, they're learning things about McDowall. How has the support been, or has there been like a change, maybe for hopefully the positive?
That's really interesting. I think at the moment in the community, what has happened here is it's opened up the chance to discuss these things, and I've heard a lot of different people having a lot of different discussions that would not otherwise have taken place. And it's given me certainly an understanding of the spectrum of viewpoints that there are. Some people who've come back and said, "Oh, this isn't racism. This has nothing to do with racism." Whereas to my mind, this is quite clearly very closely linked with modern day racism. In terms of shifting opinions, I'm not sure that we're there yet. And I think that's something that comes with education. This is the role of the school, really. And the kind of importance of anti-racist work, which is that what I've realised is a lot of very highly educated people in my community don't really understand the fundamentals of what racism is and where it comes from. And they can go, it's obviously the opportunity for adults to go out and educate themselves, but if they're not affected by racism, then there's probably not that much of a motivation to do that necessarily, which is why I think, the new anti-racist guidance and bringing it into schools and teaching about it across the board, across Scotland, is so important, because it's such a major aspect of our society. It's not just a huge injustice on a moral level, on an economic level, on a public health level. People die of this, and if we want to change it, we need to.
It's on the level of people's DNA.
I think the real important thing is that our community is now more aware and is now more able to articulate and have conversations that we did not have before. And I think that's the first step, really, in making any change, is opening up a discussion and a dialogue with people.
Great. Do you want to add anything?
Not really.
You all talked out.
Yeah.
I've never known that to happen. This is This is a world first. Roll your eyes at me.
How are you feeling about moving on? Because I understand you're changing schools now. You're going to... You'll have to forgive me. I really don't know about the schooling systems.
Oh, no, that's
yet.
okay. So Erin finished P7 just as this was still in flux, really, and the decision about changing the house names only came after she'd started S1 at high school. So it's been a big transition.
I hope, I hope that what you have done has actually not just had an impact, obviously, on the community schooling system, but also on your peers. I grew up, as I said, I grew up in South Africa, and part of my childhood was during apartheid, and then obviously after apartheid. But being an Indian person, sometimes in South Africa, it's just you're caught in the middle. You're not good enough either way, it just kind of makes you sit there. And I think about myself, as in school, and it's just like, well, what's the point in fighting? What's the point in asking questions? Because you just got that feedback, well, this is the curriculum, this is what you've got to learn. And I'm like, but it makes no sense. And I think about myself feeling very, very trapped. And you are such an inspiration, and I hope that you make people of your age and younger people think about the world that they're living in. I think young people in general now are so much more open-minded. I think thanks to the internet and the access to information. But I hope you have had that effect on those around you.
I would hope so too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Erin. And drawing this podcast to a close, I'd like to thank our guests, Erin and Leah, for your time, for your thoughts, your opinions, and I'd like to say goodbye.
Thank you, Arti. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you so much.
We are pleased to see that there is work being done in Renfrewshire to acknowledge all aspects of its history, including a legacy of slavery, such as this Frederick Douglass walking tour created by Renfrewshire Leisure and introduced by Laura Hamilton. It is only through the work of anti-racist activists such as Erin and her mum Leah that these kinds of heritage projects come about, so it is important that we support their campaigns and keep pushing for change. We have Black History Month, but we still have a long way to go in terms of schools, public institutions and the government being honest about Scotland's involvement in slavery and the slave trade, and how the profits from this built many of our grand streets and buildings.
Hi, my name is Laura Hamilton and I'm a creative learning worker at Paisley Museum, Renfrewshire Leisure. I'm really excited to let you know about the launch of the Frederick Douglass self-led walking tour in Paisley. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in the United States of America in 1817. However, he escaped slavery and became a very important abolitionist, campaigning for many years for enslaved people to gain their freedom. In 1845, he came to Britain and gave speeches in many towns and cities, speaking about the horrors of slavery and campaigning for slavery to end. He also argued strongly against a new church group in Scotland called the Free Church of Scotland, as the new Free Church had accepted money from slaveholders in the southern United States of America. Fellow abolitionists agreed with Frederick Douglass that the church should send the money back. His speeches were very popular, and he spoke at least 8 times in Paisley during 1846. The free, self-guided Frederick Douglass walking tour features 5 different locations where the speeches took place in Paisley. They are the Exchange Rooms, located above the shops on Moss Street, close to the Piazza Shopping Centre, at Paisley Abbey, at 2 former United Secession churches, one at Abbey Close, opposite Paisley Abbey, and the other at George Street. Sadly, the church buildings no longer exist, However, at Abbey Close, the graveyard of the church is still there, as well as the former West Relief Church, which is currently being refurbished and best viewed from Canal Street. The walking tour is a 3-kilometre loop and takes approximately 45 minutes to 1 hour to complete. All 5 locations are highlighted in a Google map with a suggested circular route around each of the locations. The tour route is wheelchair accessible and stroller friendly. There is also an accompanying tour website featuring more information on the life of Frederick Douglass and each of the 5 locations where his speeches took place. This tour is the first in a series of walking tours produced as part of the Heritage on Your Doorstep project funded by Museums Galleries Scotland and Renfrewshire Leisure. To access the Frederick Douglass Walking Tour Google Map and tour website, please visit the Renfrewshire Leisure website at www.renfrewshireleisure.com, as well as following us on social media at Paisley Museum.
Thank you so much for listening. We've been A Brew A Blether, a Kairos Women Plus community produced podcast. If you like what you've heard, you can follow us on social media, all the usual places, or you can look at our website, kairoswomen.org, and I'll spell that out for you. It's KAIROSWOMEN. If you have any questions or comments on the series, we would love to hear from you. Please get in touch.
This series was made possible through the Great Place Scheme, a project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and delivered through Renfrewshire Council. The music you've heard is by Lakbay Lahi, the song Pag-ibig, which means love in Filipino. Love is central to our ethos at Kairos, and a lot of love and volunteer time goes into all of our projects. Thanks to the guests and volunteers who give their time to make this podcast happen.